Benny Ortiz. Just want to say thank you for coming, and you're in for a treat tonight because you're going to talk about stuff that I don't think you've ever discussed at a seminar before, right?
No, this is all going to be new stuff. So thank you so much for having me here. Thank you, Custom Rod and Reel. If you haven't been to the shop, for the people that are watching, this is an outstanding place for all of your tackle needs, and they do a lot of really great seminars. So today is not going to be a typical Slow Pitch 101 seminar. This is going to be advanced stuff, fish theory, and very, very, very technical. So if you have notes on your phone, you might want to take those if you're interested. But we're going to go through a lot of things that people don't necessarily think about when they're first starting out, and kind of the things that go through my mind in terms of what I'm looking for when I'm on the water. So I have my board here. So first thing I'm going to start out with is what are the three key principles of slow jigging, right? And really it's the three key principles of fishing in general. So the first thing, you want to entice the bite. There's a bunch of different things you can do to make that fish bite, and I'm going to go through different techniques to do that. Number two, you got to hook the fish, right? So we're going to talk really in depth about hooks, how those hooks work, how they function, what are the best hooks to use, to my opinion, and based on experience. And then we're going to talk about landing the fish, different techniques to actually get those fish to the boat using this super light tackle. You know, I always go through this. This is a OSHA Jigger Infinity Motive from Shimano. This is the newest rod that we have out. And this is the first time that Shimano introduced a Japanese domestic market rod into the United States at the same time that they released it in Asia. The reason why that's important is because they realize now that this has picked up so much steam. And me doing this for 12, 13 years now and going on the seminar tour for 10 years and doing all this stuff, watching it pick up and grow has been really great to experience. So, enticing the bite. What we're going to go through is fish locations, okay? And that means both bait and predatory fish, right? Because the predatory fish are going to go where the bait are, so we need to know where the bait is and how those fish are going to attack those bait fish, right? We're going to talk about the size of those fish that are going to be attacking those bait fish, the reason why they do that, and then we're going to go through some fish senses, okay? How do fish perceive things? Most of the time, full disclaimer, I'm not a fish scientist, but I've done a lot of research online about this, so there is some stuff that I've picked up over the years that I think is important. We'll go particularly through their three main senses, which is auditory, their sound, what can fish hear, all right? What can fish see, and what does the lateral line do, and how does that affect your tackle selection while you're out there, all right? So, I attended a seminar. It was given by Mr. Higashimura. Mr. Higashimura is the founder of Deep Liner in Japan, probably one of the best jig fishermen in Japan, along with several other notable people like Hiroto Yamamoto, obviously Norihiro Sato, who invented the entire thing. But in this situation here, what we have is obviously our structure on the bottom, and in the top one we say there's 1 knot of current coming at the structure. On the bottom, no current at all. So I'm going to open it up to the group. In this particular situation, where do you think the bait is going to be hanging out? Anybody? Open floor. In front. Exactly. Bait is generally going to be in this location here. Why is it going to be there? By the current. No, the current is coming at it, right? The bait fish are going to be in that location because generally bait fish, very small fish, are going to be eating things like plankton. That's going to be coming in the water column this way at the fish. They want to be in front of that structure when there's current coming at them in order to eat that plankton that's coming up, okay? Predatory fish are going to be hanging out probably in this location, keeping in structure. Don't forget that predatory fish, it is a eat or be eaten world down there. Okay, so if a fish needs to come out of structure, it is placing itself in danger to do so. If you have no current there, where's the bait going to be hanging out? Bait's going to be hanging really tight to the structure. Okay, so the purpose of this is if you're in a situation where there is some current, you can know where your boat positioning should be and where your target should be for your jig. So you're going to be coming up off of that structure more. If you have no current at all, that affects your jig position in the water where you're going to be focusing much lower in the water column. The fish are going to be hanging tight down there. They're going to be balled up very tight to that bottom. So you want to make sure that you're keeping in that very tiny part of the water column. Obviously, we're using our fish sounder, right? We're looking at our bottom machine to know where those marks are. But generally speaking, this is how it's going to shake out in terms of the location of those fish. So, mentioned before, it's either eat or be eaten out there. So in this situation, where are the bait going to go when a predatory fish comes up and eats them? Right? So the predatory fish are going to come up in this direction or this direction to get at that bait ball. What's going to happen with that bait? It's going to start moving, right? It's going to start moving. It's also going to potentially be injured. Right? So fish don't always grab them. Sometimes they knock one, maybe the eye gets damaged and it kind of is wonky. Maybe it's stunned. Maybe that fish has been knocked out and it starts floating down here, right? But you're going to have essentially a very fast action. You're going to have a fleeing action. You're going to have kind of a spiral of where that fish is injured, okay? And then you're going to have those ones that just fall down here, okay? In this situation, right, fish don't get to become big fish by putting themselves in danger, right? They tend to stay close to that structure because once they come out, I've said it 3 times now, they're going to be vulnerable to other fish eating them, whether it's a shark or bigger fish of other species, even the same species, right? So if these fish are attacking the bait, what kind of weight fish do you think are going to start chasing these baits, right? In this situation where the bait is moving quickly and zigzagging away, generally speaking, those are going to be smaller fish, all right? The reason why smaller fish, they haven't been around that long, so they don't really know of the danger that they're in. They're also more energetic. I'm very good friends with a captain who he traveled the world in marlin tournaments, and I asked him one time, I was like, what's it like to catch a grander? And he said, it's really not that bad. It's worse when they're 500 pounds. Because those are the teenagers that are all hopped up and they're stronger, and those are the fish that are going to be taking that risk to go out there. Think like a teenage boy, all hopped up on testosterone running out after those fish. This one is kind of spiraling, doing weird stuff, right? This is going to be a bit bigger fish that's going to target that because this one, it's going to be able to get them probably faster because it's closer to the structure where the fish are, so a bigger dominant fish is going to come up. These fish down here, they're going to be the biggest fish that are going to attack those, okay, in this lower water column. Those fish are going to stay closer to the structure. Again, they didn't get to be big fish by, putting themselves in danger, so your bigger fish are going to be on the bottom. What does that mean for you? That means these different actions here basically represent your jig, what you're making your jig do in the water, right? There is a very fast retrieve up. There is kind of a jerky retrieve, right? And sometimes, you can, if you actually have your reel in this position, kind of like a running situation like that, you can get the jig moving very quickly, zigzagging away. This is a jig that's kind of spiraling up, right? So it's a very slow, even cadence, right? And this one, you're focusing on the fall, okay? So larger fish down here, focusing more on the fall. One of the things that we always talk about, focusing on the fall of the jig in my Jigging 101 seminars. The reason why I tell people focus on the fall is because most of the time your bites and strikes are going to happen on the bottom. But as I progress through this, what I've learned is that the retrieve is almost as important as the fall, okay? So don't forget about the retrieve of your jig. The movement of the jig is going to capture the fish's attention. The pause and the fall is usually where the strike happens, okay? There's my disclaimer again. No, I'm not a fish scientist, but we're going to go through some bro science here. So, first thing is auditory. What can fish hear? So for humans, we can hear from about 20 hertz to 20,000 hertz. Pretty broad spectrum of what we can hear. Fish generally can hear from that same low 20 hertz, but only up to about 2,000 hertz. So what does that mean? What it means is that the fish are limited to low-pitched sounds. Think thuds, not jingle jangle of your hooks, right? So when we have 4 hooks bouncing around on this thing, the fish probably can't hear it, but they can maybe feel it on their lateral line moderately. But for the most part, even if you've ever seen videos of grouper kind of underwater and they're making that thud, that kind of grunt sound, they're not making high-pitched sounds. They're kind of keyed into lower-pitched sounds. Sound travels very well in water. Light doesn't really transmit that much. What that equates to for jigging, though, is your line size, okay? Your line is going to vibrate in the water as you're moving the jig, and the jig is doing what jigs do and falling actions. If you have thicker line, you're going to create more sound in the water, okay? So that's another reason, besides the vertical position and trying to keep up and down as well as good as you can, that's another reason why we're getting our line size down. Previously, I was using 50 and 60 pound leaders a lot. I noticed several times on trips where people who were using 40 pound leaders were getting bit more than me. And I said, that's interesting. So I started dialing down to a 40 pound leader. I'm even experimenting now with 30 pound leaders. We're going to talk about knots and that allow us to use that light of a leader to catch fish like large grouper on it. But for the most part, we want to scale down our tackle as much as possible. Okay, anything that's either whether it's on the rod, the reel, anything that you can scale down, we want to scale down, including our hooks that are on there. All right, does it make sense? All right. So, fish senses continued. So, people who've done studies of fish eyes find that the fish have rods and cones, just like us. Rods are what help us see the black and white contrast. Cones are what help you see color. Fish do not have the same type of color receptors in their eyes that humans do. Also, when you're at depth, this color that you see at depth is not the color that you see at the surface. We've all talked about that before in multiple seminars. And what we know is that, kind of Roy G. Biv, as we go through that water column, red is the first one to disappear all the way down to your violets. Then you got your ultraviolets or your whites, and then your ultraviolets that'll penetrate deeper than that. But what that equates to for fish, and what fish you're seeing, is that you've basically got 2 different types of fish, right? You've got your offshore fish, your pelagic fish, things like that, your tunas, your wahoos, billfish, things like that. They have eye sensors that are more geared towards contrast, okay? Because they're going through that water quick and they're just looking for a contrast, which is one of the reasons why wahoo fishing is really great at sunrise and really great at sunset. Because the sun is low, it creates a contrast. When the light hits the bait fish, it casts a shadow. That's why you're able to catch wahoo in that area. That's how they're hunting, right? So same thing with the jig. You're not necessarily worried about the color of the jig in that situation. You're worried more about the contrast if you're looking for pelagic style fish. Whereas a coastal fish, and I don't mean coastal like just near shore, like your demersal fish, your grouper, your snapper complex, cobies, things like that, they have more sensors for color. Okay, so they can be keyed into specific colors, but again, they don't see the same colors that we see. I think that the color is probably one of the least important things in terms of jig selection. We'll talk about that a little bit later. But for the most part, again, contrast is really what we're looking for. So I like jigs that have a good contrast, kind of like this shimmer fall here. This is the sand eel pattern, that dark to light. And then you look at jigs like these. These are our sardine wavers. So we've got 3 styles here. This silver one, obviously it's not the contrast jig, but just to give you an example of colors, this gold is really good for contrast. This one has dark to light on it. Again, contrast. Those types of things are what the fish are going to be keyed into. Those are the things that you should look for in terms of effectiveness of the jig. What I will say though, and I've said this in a bunch of seminars, is I believe that deep water fish can see UV light. So when I mean UV light, I mean you've hit it with a UV light. See how that chartreuse is lighting up on the side, reflecting that UV light that's on there? I think that's a big thing for deep water fish. So, I've used black jigs in deep water that are UV reflective. I've used silver jigs in water from Shimano that are called a Kimura finish, which has a blue UV reflective that are on it. Those will get bit more than jigs that don't have that on there. So kind of proof is in the pudding in terms of the stuff that I have caught. If it reflects UV light, good. If it doesn't, not as good, but I still want to have that contrast in the jig, okay? When fish see other fish that they're going to be going after, whether it's a bait ball or whatever, think about the direction of travel, okay, of that bait. So what do fish want to do? I have up there, it says the fly example, all right? If you have a fly that's flying directly at your face, what do? You can't do one of those, go back, you swat. It's unpleasant, right? If something is traveling at you, even if you are in freshwater situations, most of the time, if that bait is traveling at a fish, it doesn't want anything to do with it. It's going to spook, it's going to go away, okay? So the direction of travel, going back to that first slide that I had, which was if the bait is up here and the fish are coming to chase it this way, and you have one shooting and one kind of zigzagging, one spiraling up, they're going to chase way more than they're going to want something just falling right at them very quickly, okay? So keep that in mind. The retrieve is very, very important. They want to see that bait moving away from them and eventually pause, and then they're going to go in to get that bait, okay? Don't rush. The biggest thing that I see, people who are just getting into this is they go too fast. And I don't mean the retrieve is too fast. I mean, they don't let the jig just get down to the bottom of its fall, let it pause for a second, let it see what that jig did. The fish might be right there to go get it, and then you move it again. You see people, this kind of erratic action, or they're trying to, doing smooth, smooth it out. If you ever watch me on videos, one of the biggest comments that people say is, I can't believe how smooth it looks when you do this, right? The whole idea is to create a smooth, fluid action of that jig. So when I think about, actually, let me just grab this here. So when I think of a rod, I don't think of my jigging action as just lifting up like this. I think of it as I'm trying to crack a whip, okay? I'm trying to get the line the wave to go through the rod. So if you ever pay attention very closely into the positioning of my arm, you'll notice that I'm not just doing this, I'm doing this, right? I'm coming out with my shoulder. Pushing on this rod and coming out is letting that rod fully load. That S-wave goes entirely through the blank of the rod, and the rod will gently flick the jig out in the water. I don't want to just pull that jig up in a vertical fashion. I don't want to just do that. I want to let this rod, the beautiful actions, take advantage of that beautiful action that they have. All of them are very parabolic, and all of them will impart the right action on the jig with the proper technique, okay? And again, you want to create the chase, eat or be eaten world. So, visual continued. Perception of time. What the heck is this guy talking about? There's a thing that's measured, it's called the critical flicker fusion frequency, okay? Big term. What does that mean? Basically, it means how fast a blinking light, how much can you see in terms of hertz, in terms of cycle rates of it, before it just becomes a solid white light, all right? In humans, it's usually about 60 hertz, give or take. In fish, it is generally much higher than that. So by the perception of time, I don't mean that the fish is down there and going, man, this day is really long, it's just dragging, the time is just moved slow. What I mean is that it measures the clarity in visualizing fast-moving objects, okay? If you ever watched a pelagic fish or a marlin turn on a bait and you wonder how the heck it did that, it's because the photoreceptors in its eyes are processing that movement so much faster that they can actually make those movements on the fish. Offshore pelagic fish are going to have a higher critical flicker fusion frequency than your inshore fish, but both are generally higher or faster than humans. So when the fish sees that slow-moving object, you have that beautiful pace that you're creating with the action of your jig, that once that thing pauses or it's moving slowly and naturally, that it's going to look like it's hovering to those fish, right? It's not just lifting up and down and just letting the jig fall aimlessly. It's creating a pattern. So when I say pace, I mean that like you want to start and vary your cadences, vary your actions that you're doing. Sometimes it's, you're only really moving the rod to get that jig to move. It's a very slow, just, maybe a half turn, maybe a quarter turn. Repeat that process, okay? Repeat that process when you're down there. It's so important to get into a pattern and change that pattern. If you're not getting bites on one pattern, try a different pattern. The key is to be smooth. The key is to remember which ones are working and which ones aren't working and change that cadence to the conditions of that particular day. So you're not always doing the same thing. You're not just slamming that jig on the bottom and just doing one of these, right? We're creating that natural movement, and by that perception of time that these fish have, that natural movement flows together with your bait. It doesn't look like a thing with hooks that are swinging around. It actually looks like a very natural presentation where this thing is hovering in the water just like a fish would, a bait fish that they're going to be going after, all right? So, we have a couple of takeaways about our fish senses. Number one, that the fish probably cannot hear the jingle jangle of hooks, which is why we're able to use 4 hooks, jingle jangling around, and it doesn't scare the fish away. Fish can hear and feel thuds, so bounce the bottom. Bounce the bottom with your jig. The old mutton fisherman that keep that sinker still, you're going to spook the fish, that kind of thing. Out the window, doesn't matter. I've been in so many situations where bouncing that jig on the bottom will do a couple of things. It will, first of all, it'll stir up a little sediment down there. Fish will kind of go in curiously to look at it. I've seen this on camera with fish, particularly in deep water, like snowy groupers. You watch a sinker hit the bottom on camera, and you just see fish come out to go look at it, right? Don't be afraid to bounce the bottom and to check out what's going on at the bottom. It's going to create that curiosity, and then the movement of that jig up and that fluid motion, that cadence that you have is going to create the chase, and then ultimately that's going to lead to the bite. Contrast over, so I went through 4, then contrast over color, 1 through the jig selection. That's what I want you to take away from that, is that the color of the jig is much less important than than the contrast that it's going to create. It's not like, oh my God, I need to have, like, you go out to California, no offense, California, sorry guys, but they like that blue and pink, right? For whatever reason, the blue and pink, the Katy Perry, I need that. Doesn't matter. It doesn't matter, guys, all right? Colors don't matter. I've seen fish caught on every single color of jig, from white to black to gold to silver to orange and greens and all kinds of stuff. Reflects UV light, good. Creates contrast, good. Don't worry too much about jig selection. I fished with a lot of very, very good jig fishermen from Japan. They don't care what color jig. They don't even look. They just look for the weight, okay? So just worry about the conditions and matching it to that particular day. Is there any questions before we go on to our next stuff? In the back. What's that? Line selection? Oh, we'll talk about that. I'll get you in a minute on that. Is that okay? All right. Yeah. Uh-huh. So I think that when I was talking about the jigs, I wasn't referencing like just this particular jig for deep water. The other one. What is this? This jig? When I had the flashlight on it? Okay. What I was saying about deep water is that deep water fish, to my opinion and based on experience, can see UV light. I'm talking north of 600 feet on the bottom. Once you get into that kind of black zone where the colors are completely washed out and light penetration is pretty low, those fish are down there and they still have eyes. They have pretty big eyes, but they have eyes, right? If there wasn't a reason for them to see things down there in the pitch black, they wouldn't have them. Right, so I think that the only thing that's going to penetrate that water deeper than the visible light spectrum is the ultraviolet light spectrum, which is why on ultraviolet light, when you see that chartreuse light up, That's what they see, right? What would I catch? Anything that swims. I mean, it's not a species-specific thing, right? I'm not. If I'm in deep water and I'm targeting deep water fish, it could be a queen snapper, it could be a snowy, it could be a yellow edge, it could be a tile fish, either a blue line or a golden. It could be a Wenchman snapper. It could be any number of deep water fish that are out there. I don't really. That's the beauty part about jigging, right? Is that it's not necessarily a species-specific thing. You never know what you're going to get. Kind of box of chocolates, Forrest Gump. What's that? No, absolutely not. We're going to talk about boat positioning in a bit. No, absolutely not. But no, so it's different. So different types. So the question was, if you couldn't hear it, was, do you have to fish structure? And the answer to that is no. And that really comes into fish-specific species and how they really prefer, right? So in my experience, if you are on deep water structure, usually, I'm talking like a wreck, right? Usually that's going to hold snowy grouper right on it, okay? But yellow edge grouper are going to hang out to the sides. They're going to hang out more on the mud bottom around the sides of it. If you're looking for something like tilefish generally are on silt bottom, right? There's only one place that I know of where tilefish will hang out on rocky bottom, and that's in New England. I've never seen any other situation where tilefish will hang out in other than silt bottom, because they make burrows, they get into the burrows, and if you have a good enough transducer on your boat and you zoom in, you can actually see the triangular burrow that they have on the bottom. You have to have a really good transducer, at least 1500 on there. So if you can, you're going to look for just flat silt bottom for golden tiles, for instance. Same thing with blue line tiles, but they're going to be a little bit shallower still on that silt bottom. One of the things, and we'll talk about boat positioning a little bit later, is that oftentimes people are so keyed into the number and they want to fish the number, and the number happens to be dead center on the structure, and they forget about all of the stuff that's going to be around them, around that structure, that different species will be in different areas. So for instance, if you're in the Gulf of Mexico, or Gulf of America, sorry, if you're in the Gulf and you're in a wreck in 800 feet of water, right, it would behoove you to make multiple passes on that wreck, one straight down the center, right, straight down the center of that wreck once you have your drift lined up, or if you have a Rodan or a Minn Kota or a power pole. By the way, power pole ones, awesome for spot lock systems. Use that to keep yourself right in that center, and then don't be afraid to start bumping around and seeing what else is out there. In shallow water conditions, mutton snappers tend to be off on the side, right? So they're not necessarily on the structure. The red grouper will be on the structure. The other stuff will be kind of off to the side. Don't forget about the stuff that's around those fish. And then for like queen snapper, they tend to be on ledges. They tend to be on ledges. If you find actual bottom topography that changes, the queen snapper will be in there. The bigger queen snapper tend to be higher up in the water column than the smaller snapper. So they're often, if you come up in the water column with those, particularly at a higher speed jig, a higher pitch rate, I guess you could say, the larger snapper generally are going to hang up above structure, sometimes as high as 100 feet off of that structure. And particularly in places like Pulley Ridge, or even across the stream once you get out towards the Bahamas. Bahamas are going to be significantly deeper. You're going to have the queen snappers 12 to 1400 feet over there, which is quite deep. Whereas in the Gulf, they're going to be hanging out in that 600 to 700 range. Probably between shallowest I've caught queens is probably about 450-ish. Deepest I've caught queens in the Gulf was just shy of 700. So you're going to be looking in that kind of water column, whereas over in the Bahamas, you're looking for significantly deeper water. Good thing about the Bahamas is that you're completely out of the stream, so you have very little current. You can use lighter jigs to get down in that deeper water. So does that cover everything? Yeah. Yes. Oh, one more? You can go. No, we'll finish up with you. You got one more. Yeah. Would I fish there in 200 feet? Sure, absolutely. No, but that's what you usually fish 200 feet. You usually fish 200 feet? No, in the Tortugas, it can be anything. The biggest mutton snapper I ever caught in my life was in 60 feet of water on a jig in the Tortugas, on an anchor, of all things. which I hate anchor fishing with jigs. It's one of the most difficult things. But when you drop a jig, usually on anchor, the first fish is going to be the biggest fish. Then eventually the fish have seen that jig so many times that they're not really interested, unless kind of like when you're bass fishing, you just do it enough and it pisses them off, and then they finally strike. But for the most part, you're going to get your biggest fish very early if you're on anchor in that particular situation. Now, the rest of your question was about where else would I fish in the Tortugas? Anything. I have no limits in terms of where I'm going to fish, how deep I'm going to fish. 200-foot range in the Tortugas I find is really good because you have multiple species that are going to be in that area, right? And it opens you up to more bites. So you're going to have everything from, your mutton snapper, your kingfish, cobias, red groupers. Sometimes you'll get other species of groupers in shallow, black groupers, right? Gag groupers sometimes will show up in that area. I've only caught one in pulley or in the Tortugas-ish area, not quite Tortugas, not quite pulley, kind of in between, and it was a 40-pounder, so they're still out there. But it'll give you the most options. And then at nighttime in that 200-foot zone in the Tortugas, you have tuna all night long, as many as you want out there. So
you were talking about the jigs and that pretty much any fish will bite a jig, but does it come down to a specific technique in this jigging technique? It'll catch a sailfish, it'll catch a marlin, it'll catch a grouper, it'll catch whatever. So the technique is not specific to types of fish and what they're looking for.
right. Yeah, what you're doing with the jigs is you're mimicking that wounded or injured bait fish. So any fish that is predatory and eats another fish is going to be interested in that jig. So have I caught a sailfish on a jig? Yes. Did I catch it how you normally would? Absolutely not. It hit in 225 feet on the bottom up in Jupiter. And it ran straight out away from the back of the boat and started coming up towards the surface. And I thought, this is awesome. This is going to be a really nice cobia. And then a bill came out of the water. And I was like, uh-oh, better back down that drag and very slowly get this thing in. And it was probably a 70-ish pound sailfish. And that was the first sailfish that I've caught. I've seen multiple sailfish hooked. I've seen very few landed. In terms of billfish, one of the wildest things that I've ever seen, I was on the Yankee Caps, and I was in the bow of the boat, and one of the guys was dropping way back in the stern. He hooks up on a marlin. This thing, he loses the weight of the jig, gets tight on it, and I just look out, and I just see this, it had to be 300-400 pounds, just greyhounding out of the water. I mean, most powerful thing I've ever seen happen, and it was, in an instant. Do billfish hit jigs often? I can't say they do. So some fish are kind of more keyed into different areas. I think particularly with the billfish, they tend to be much higher in the water column, which we're not really focusing on, but they will follow those jigs down. I've even had, not oftentimes, but I have seen a sailfish just follow the jig right to the boat. And you're just winding up, and you just see him just following, and then he just goes off and does a sailfish thing. So it's not necessarily the species of the fish. There are species-specific techniques, like for instance, grouper tend to be closer to the bottom, so you're going to want to keep your jig closer to the bottom. That's where they live. That's not to say that grouper aren't going to chase that jig, though. Right? I can't tell you how many grouper I've caught 50, 60 feet off the bottom on a chase, and that goes back to what I was saying about having that cadence, right? Having that smooth action. Usually, my approach to it: pull up to a spot, drop down. First thing I'm going to do when that jig hits the bottom is I'm going to kind of rip it up about maybe 50, 60 feet. Not only is that going to get any kind of scope or belly out of my line, but usually the more bigger dominant fish are going to chase that thing because they're angry, right? And we're going to talk about something in a minute about fish behavior, particularly with spawn cycles, of them, why they're going to chase that, particularly grouper. You have your other fish like amberjacks, for instance. They're just going to chase because they like to chase, right? And then you're going to hook into those rubber lips, and you're never going to pull a hook on an amberjack, right? Unfortunately, but snappers, smaller movements, kind of like a dart and a fall, a dart and a fall. They kind of key into that, but we're going to go down there. Any more questions? All right. Okay. So we always talk about jig selection, and people generally give the 1 gram per foot or 1.5 grams per foot. So I'm sorry I don't have freedom units up there, guys, but we're going to use meters because this is just an easier way to meet the formula. So 100 meters, about 300 feet. In completely neutral conditions, 0 knots, your formula for jig selection should be your depth in meters times 2. Okay, super simple. All right, so if you're in 300 feet of water, a 200-gram jig should get to the bottom just fine, with no problem. That's not to say that you can't use a larger jig depending on the profile of the jig and how you want to present it, but that's kind of our baseline. Now from that formula, we're going to adjust for current. All right, so we're going to take the neutral weight. So let's say we're in that same 100 meters, okay, but now we're in a knot and a half of current. So we have our 200-gram jig. We're going to times that by the speed in knots, and that's going to give us the weight of jig that we should probably start with. Okay, and I say start with because everything is evolving. You're always looking at the conditions of the day. Sometimes there's different layers of current, right? So sometimes you need to have a little bit heavier jig. I'm talking in kind of ideal hypothetical situations. This is going to give you a ballpark idea of where you should start, okay? Always adjust to the conditions. Always, always, always. Don't be afraid to change. With respect to change, though, what I like people to focus on and what I think is important in kind of how my jigging has evolved over the years, I used to roll out when I first started with, you know, let's say I have 100 jigs in my bag and there's 30 different types of jigs in there, all different models, all different makes, all different weights. Over time, I'm basically down to about 3 or 4 shapes that I use now, particularly. And the reason why is because I think knowing how that jig is going to perform in any condition is significantly more important than having a variety of jigs. Yes, I've been on the boat, and shout out to Lewis if you're watching, where I had basically the same exact setup sitting right next to someone, and I can't catch a fish for the life of me, and they're on every single drop. I fish with Jim, who's here a million times. We go out all the time together. He knows exactly how that goes. There'll be a day where he's completely on. There'll be a day where I'm completely on. And we don't know what's going on with that. For whatever reason, they're not biting the shape that I have. That's just how fishing goes sometimes. But overall, big picture, knowing exactly what those jigs are going to do in the water is the most important thing. Okay, so what I like to do is have multiple jigs in different weights. So that's why I have this example here. These are Shimano Shimmer Falls. They go, whoops. We go from 100 grams, 140 grams, 170 grams, 210 grams. All of these jigs are specifically designed to fall the exact same way in the water despite being different weights, okay? That's kind of one of the other hallmarks of a good jig manufacturer, not only having good fits and finishes to your jigs, but also that those jigs perform well no matter in the same way, no matter what weight you're going to be using, because you can use, you know, I'll be in Rhode Island fishing for stripers with, you know, this little 100-gram jig, or I can be offshore in the Gulf in 400 feet using this 210-gram jig, and I know exactly how it's going to perform in the water. So that's something that's super important. One of the reasons why I particularly like original manufactured jigs as opposed to kind of the knockoff stuff. I'm not saying that the knockoff stuff doesn't copy it like exactly, but if they've gone through the time to make the jig, go through the technology, test it, do all that stuff, I like to support those kind of companies. Shimano is one of them. They have a bunch of different proprietary models and makes that they have. So we'll talk about the jigs in a little bit. So shape versus current. All right, so we have 3 kind of hypothetical situations here. We've got a Lake of Atlantic day. We've got 0 to 0.5 knots. So in those situations, where we're going to start is something with a wider profile, something like this wing fall, okay? This jig is flat on both sides. It's going to have a big, wide cradle action on it. It's going to create a bunch of different actions in the water, but primarily it's going to be pretty fluttery because it's going to pick up a lot more water just on having a larger profile and a wider profile, okay? Once you're into that 0.5 to a knot and a half, I have something like this, which is a sardine waver. Still a bit thicker profile, but you notice that this bottom is convex. It's rounded. It's not, there's no keel on it, like a sharp keel on it, but a rounded edge on there. And what that does is creates kind of a cradle fall like this. That moderate action that you're going to have on here is going to be able to do several things. First is, you're going to be able to keep that good cadence, but with a jig like this, you can actually get this thing to swim along the water because there's not any hard angles on there that are going to make it do some crazy stuff. Okay, so it's going to not have too much current influence with that knot and a half, up to a knot and a half, but it's going to give you very good action when you're down there. Once you get into that knot and a half to 3 knots, we're looking for a longer profile jig, a jig that has a flat bottom like this. Okay, so flat bottom, longer profile, cuts through the water better, and this is going to give you the best chance to stay vertical in those higher current situations. Higher current situations are difficult. That is something that we face here on the East Coast. So when I first started doing this, I live here in Pompano Beach, and I started right out here off of Fort Lauderdale doing this. And you all know the stream moves in pretty close sometimes, and we have a lot of current. Sometimes there'll be 4 knots of current and 100 feet of water. And that's difficult. So it's kind of like jumping into the deep end of the pool with this jigging stuff really early. So I kind of learned how to deal with those higher currents from a free drifting boat, which is about as least ideal as you possibly can get. And when we were doing it, nobody was jigging, so no captains knew how to pilot the boat, actually. So it was really cool to try to figure that out together. So what we've determined over the time is that you basically are going to have kind of actions, and again, this is not all the time, but this is a place to start in terms of what you're looking to do. You have your 0 to 1 knot situation, okay? Very small, quiet movements, okay? So when I say small movements, I'm talking just subtle movements like this, right? Pitching, moving, very small, quiet uplifts. When I say quiet, I just mean just creating that very slight action. Just let the jig kind of just dance in the water. I'm not doing this, right? I'm not trying to go up like that. I don't want that herky-jerky action that's on there. Very slow, methodical. Keep that pace that we talked about before. 1 to 4 knot, we're going to go a little bit faster in that action because we want that jig to actually be able to punch through that current a little bit more. So in that case, maybe I'll have a little bit faster action. Maybe sometimes I'll kind of punch that jig through the water a little bit, okay? Once we get into a situation, and have anybody experienced this out here, multi-layer currents, where you have a situation where you're dropping the jig through the water. You're like, man, this thing should have hit the bottom by now. What's going on? And then you realize, oh, it's dead flat calm on top, but the current's ripping on the bottom that way, and it took my jig. So in those kind of situations where you have multiple layer currents, you want to create a much stronger punchy action. You want to pitch that jig through the water kind of hard because you need to break through that multi-layer current that's affecting the jig on the bottom. You want that jig to slide and to swim in those situations. So very low current, small actions, right? Faster current, slightly faster current, a little bit faster uplift, a little bit faster fall of the jig. Once you're into that multi-layer situation, you're kind of moving that thing pretty quickly. You still have the fall of the jig, right? But you really want to get that jig to swim. When you get that jig to swim, let it swim. So often I see people stopping it from swimming. Don't stop it from swimming. Give it a pause, give it a second. Once it goes, don't drop your rod tip. You make that punch, and you watch that jig follow that slack in your line until you feel the weight of your jig again. Oftentimes, you'll see people cut that short, unintentionally cut that short, and I say that for a reason because you can cut it short, and we'll talk about that in a little while. But they'll unintentionally cut it short, and they're not letting that jig kind of finish what it was supposed to do. Oftentimes those fish are chasing, and they're going to come up later on and get those jigs maybe right before you're about to pitch. And if you stop that jig from falling too soon, they're not going to do it. They're going to turn away from that. Okay. Now this is purely Mr. Higashimura. And I've noticed kind of in the time since his seminar, try to pay attention to what I'm seeing on the water, and it seems to be very true in terms of what fish are doing in different cycles of the year, okay? So we have a hypothetical calendar, January on top, goes all the way around in a big circle. So we're gonna start fresh in January, and we're going down towards March, and we go down towards June, and in June the spawn happens. And after June, I'm just saying hypothetically, I don't know exactly when the spawn happens, but let's just say that spawn happens in June and then goes back up towards January. And how does that affect your jig selection and what you're looking for? Well, if you have a situation where these fish are getting ready pre-spawn, right? They're ready, they're doing their fish thing, the eggs are inside of them, and they're getting ready to ultimately spawn. What do they need to do? They need to eat a lot more, right? So they're going to be more voracious when they're down there. That it's going to affect your jig selection. We'll talk about that in a second. But your feeding pattern is going to be up. They're going to be wanting to eat a lot of stuff. What else are they going to do? Fish are very territorial, right? So it's not, sometimes you're not catching a fish because the fish just wants to eat the jig because it's hungry. Sometimes the fish is trying to kill another thing with its face because it's saying, get out of here. This is my rock, right? So as that pre-spawn to spawn happens, what we're going to be looking for in your jig selection is a longer profile jig. Okay, longer profile jig. If the fish has the opportunity to catch an easy meal, and again, this is what we're doing, we're trying to create that easy meal for the fish with that good cadence, you're going to want to have a longer profile. Okay, one of the best ways to do that is if you're on a boat and you go out with a charter captain. So for instance, we have EJS charters that are over there. They're here local here in Boca. They do slow pitch jigging charters. Ask your captain, right? Ask your captain when they're out there, hey, when you're cleaning fish, are you seeing eggs in these fish? And if you're seeing eggs in the fish, then you know that they're getting towards that spawn cycle. So you have an idea in that time period where your head should be in terms of your jig selection to start. If there's no eggs in those fish at all, then we go to this other section, right? Once they spawn, totally different animals. Now they're lazy. They're hanging out, just living in a little fish, under the sea, doing whatever fish do when they're not getting ready to breed, right? So in that case, our feeding patterns are down. We're not voracious anymore. We don't need that caloric intake, right? They're not as territorial. So what do we do with our jig selection? We scale it down. So even if you're using a heavier weight jig, for instance, longer profile, right? This is a 210-gram jig. This is a 250-gram jig. I'm going to go with a smaller profile, right, of relatively the same weight. I want to make it very, very easy for these lethargic fish to actually entice the bite on them, okay? So more subtle movements. Just pay attention to that spawn cycle. I'm not going to tell you that this is 100% accurate and it's going to work every single time, but again, I'm trying to give you guys just different things to think about when you're out there in terms of where should I start with my jig selection? What action should I make with my jigs? All right, well, if we know what the fish are doing and how they're behaving, then we can tailor our jig selection to those animals and hopefully have more bites. And what I've experienced is it works. It works. So pay attention when you're out there. Before we go on, any questions? Anybody? All right. Okay, line choice. I made a video about this on Instagram and had a bunch of people talk about Benny must have lost his mind. I don't think that's right. Well, 4-strand versus 8-strand. Okay, what's better? If I'm casting, I want an 8-strand line. I want a round line. I want a smooth line. If I'm jigging, I want a 4-strand line. I want a 4-strand line for a bunch of different reasons. The first of which is how that shape affects the water. Now, anybody a golfer? Any golfers out here? Yeah, one, at least one. If you guys ever go golfing, pay attention to that guy. Are golf balls smooth? No. Why are they not smooth? Exactly. What flies farther? Exactly. Why? Because it creates a disturbance around it which insulates it from the air and it creates lift. Right. Same concept with hydrodynamics. If you have a rougher line, 4-strand line is is rougher line. If this water current direction coming this way hits this round line, it's going to quickly go around that line. That's not a bad thing, but what it does is it creates this monster eddy that's coming around your line. And if you stand next to someone with a rougher line, a PE4, and this, it's not that exaggerated, but for demonstration purposes, right, it's going to hit the rougher line, and these eddies are going to be way smaller, okay? And what I tell you is if you're ever on a boat and you're in deep water, because this is particularly important when you're at depth, and I talk like over 400, 500, 600, 700 feet, if you're standing next to somebody who has 8-strand line and you have 4-strand line, pay attention to whose line scopes out first. And I bet it's not going to be you, okay? 4-strand line stays more vertical in the water than 8-strand line. What is the other benefit of having a 4-strand line over 8-strand line? I like it because it bites into my fluoro better. It's a rougher line. It's going to, when I tie a PR knot, so I have on this setup here, you can see my PR knot. This is shorter than I generally would have it, but you have an idea of my PR that's on there. Fluoro is much harder than mono. I like it because it's very abrasion resistant, and for tying a PR knot, that 4-strand line really digs into that fluoro very, very well and holds that PR knot beautifully. So I like the 4-strand line. I don't have any issues with the roughness of it. I wear gloves because I still have office hands, but at the end of the day, the 4-strand line should be a better option for you while you're out there. That's one of the reasons that I choose to use regular standard Power Pro line, right? This is standard 20-pound Power Pro that's on there. If I decide that I need something a little bit thinner diameter, then I'll go to something like a Power Pro Max Quattro. Max Quattro has a 25% thinner diameter, retains the same braking strength. I get more line on my spool. I keep a higher, my spool doesn't go down quite as far in deep water, and it still retains all the strength. So depending on where you are and what your budget is, you can kind of vary your line selection. Why is that important? Because of scope. So I am not an artist either, but you can tell that that's a boat, right? And you got a pretty bad T-top, and you got a guy who's got a line straight up and down in the water versus somebody that's scoping out. And I always say it's a math problem, right? So if you're looking at this like a triangle and you're in this position here and you're up and down, you're getting the maximum amount of action on that jig in that vertical position. If you're scoped out, this and this are the same, but you can see that if I draw a line kind of over here, I'm missing out on all that action, right, by having my line scoped out. So that's why it's so important to have a vertical presentation, or as vertical presentation in the water as possible. That way you can get the maximum action on your jig, and you have the most control of the jig, right? It's very difficult to, when you're in a situation where those, you are scoped out in that direction, and instead of jigging like in this fashion, now I'm pulling back here. I'm struggling at that point. It's not going to be a good experience for you. You're probably going to catch less fish that way. And I would highly recommend that if you can stay vertical, you should stay vertical, and your line choice is a huge component of that. So that is why I particularly like 4-strand line over 8-strand line. Fused line is another choice that people make. I find that sometimes it's flat and it's not exactly what I'm looking for. All right, before I go on, any questions about the line, that kind of stuff? Anybody? All right. All right, so we talked about a bunch of fish behavior. We talked about a bunch of weird stuff that probably a lot of people don't think about when they're out there on the water, but this is something that everybody thinks about, is boat positioning, okay? One of the questions I always get at seminars is, where do you set up the boat? So there's 3 scenarios that I have here. I have the first scenario, which is a free drift scenario. The second scenario is if you have a sea anchor on the boat, not an actual anchor, but you got a sail in the water. And then on the last section is a spot lock. So in all of these situations, current is going from the north to the south, and the wind is coming from the east going to the west. All right, so The X represents the position of the jig. So if you're in a free drifting boat that is being moved south from the current and moved to the west from the wind, if you drop right here, that boat is going to drift in this diagonal direction, okay? Ultimately, your jig, because you have that very low water influence using that very thin line that we talked about extensively, is going to stay roughly in that same position as you jigged it. It'll kind of drift a little bit south with you, but for the most part, once that boat starts moving in this direction, you're going to notice all this scope. And if you remember back to the math problem that I just showed you, that is a problem, okay? So free drifting boats are the most difficult situation to jig from. Now, I mentioned this previously in terms of the action that you can try to do to mitigate that as much as possible. And in that situation, if my jig is scoping in that direction, again, I'm not jigging vertically anymore. I'm pulling back in this direction, okay? Because I'm trying to get up that triangle as far as I possibly can to maximize the fall of the jig. And I'm doing it in a kind of a faster cadence to try to pull that jig up through the water so it's going to swim as much as it possibly can to get the most action that I can get out of it. If I'm in a situation where we have a sea anchor, and I kind of messed up when I started drawing this one just out of habit, I put the bow over here, but the bow is on this side facing this way. You got the sea anchor off the front of the boat, and it's catching, the boat's catching wind, this is catching the water, so it's slowing down your drift. So you're not moving to the west quite as much, but you still are moving south with the current. Ultimately, if you drop that jig here and it kind of stays in the same position, you're going to be not quite as bad, all right? Not quite as bad where your scope is getting minimized, right? So the sea anchor is kind of the next best thing if you don't have our third option. Third option is a spot lock, okay? I think there's been a couple developments in the fishing industry in the past, 20, 30 years. Thin diameter, highly reliable braided lines, I think, changed fishing more than any other single thing in fishing. I think that these spot locks that are out there right now have completely changed the game, along with, your bottom mapping technology. So there's nowhere where these fish can hide anymore. You know every bump that's on the bottom of the ocean, and you can put your boat anywhere that you want. So if you have this situation, your spot lock is mitigating against the wind. It's highly mitigating against any kind of drift that you have because it's powering your boat whatever direction you want it to go. I set up the bow on this side here, facing towards the east. Generally speaking, I like to have the bow into the current. I'll talk about that in a second, but I mentioned this to answer the gentleman's questions in the back. Don't be afraid to move around. Whether you're on a free drifting boat, a boat with a sea anchor on it, or if you're in a spot lock situation, don't be afraid to take multiple drifts over the same spot, but not in the same location. Use your mapping software and the trail that it leaves to know exactly where you started, get a rough idea of where that boat is going to drift, and then position east and west of that, north and south of that, depending on where you are. Covering ground is important. These fish tend to be pretty localized to wherever they're living, whether that's on the structure or over on the side, and you may be missing out on a 40-pound yellow edge that you just missed because you decided, I'm going to go on this number and stay on the number. So in terms of spot lock, the ones that, boats that I've been on that have been very successful, you've got your road ends that are out there. They're pretty good. Some captains that I've been on have had reliability issues with those, unfortunately. There's Minn Kotas that are out there. Those are very good, very reliable. The best one personally that I've seen, though, is the power pool. So if you guys are boat owners and are looking or in the market, and this isn't a sponsor thing, this is just what I've seen out there, it is dead silent quiet, and that thing has way more power than you're ever going to need. And, sometimes you'll be out there on other models of them, and you can really hear that engine working hard. On the power pool one that I've been on recently, it was very, very efficient. It had a whole lot more in the tank, which ultimately means that there's less wear and tear on the thing overall. It's a great product. That's going to be your ideal. Okay, that's going to be your ideal. You're going to be able to keep your line up in the water. You're going to be able to use the remote to, if you see your line scoping, reposition the boat ever so slightly to keep your lines in that vertical position. Why do I like to have a bow facing into the current generally? That allows people to fish on both sides of the boat, because if your jigs are moving either, let's say, north-south, okay, in this fashion here, as opposed to being kind of broadside to it. If you're here and you're drifting south and everyone's fishing on this side, your lines are going to scope, right? But if your bow's into the current and the boat is just going this way, you can reposition the boat based on where those jigs are. So you can either power drift or you can use your spot lock feature to kind of bump you up. I think that's super, super, super important, especially if you're spending the money on these center consoles that we have out there that are crazy expensive as it is. Might as well go all in, right, if you're going to do it. Easier said than done, right? Okay, so we talked all about the first part of it, which is enticing the bite and getting yourself in the best possible position to actually hook those fish or get them to bite the jig, how they're going to behave, what their fish behavior is. Now we're going to talk about the actual of hooking the fish, right? And I've told people before I can talk probably for an hour just on hooks, but we're going to talk about the hook anatomy, okay? So, very poor representation of a hook, but long part is the shank. This part's your bend or your belly, and you got your point up there. All right, everybody in the room probably knows that. This is pretty basic stuff. But there's different styles of hooks, right? So we have little short shank hooks like these. These are Gamakatsu 510 hooks, okay? Little tiny short shank on there. We have other hooks like these. This is a Gamakatsu 620 hook, which I have on here. You can see longer shank on there. These are going to do different things in terms of their performance for hooking fish. Also, what's super important is the location of the points. So, start first with a short shank hook. Shorter shank hooks will offer quick penetration, okay? Less need to actually set the hook. So if you're in a situation where you're primarily in an area where there are smaller fish that are there, sometimes they're not always monsters, right? But if you're catching a lot of beeliners, you're catching smaller fish, generally a shorter shank hook is going to be easier to penetrate in those fish. It's going to be quick penetration and less active hook setting that you need to do. So sometimes fish are kind of lethargic biters. Not all of them are going to come in hot and really hammer on it. But there is a downside to having a shorter shank hook, right? It's not going to be great for toothy stuff because you have much less metal in between you and your assist cord. And if anyone's paid attention to my prior seminars, I never use wire on anything, okay? I don't use wire on a leader. I don't use wire as a core for my assist cord. I would much rather lose an assist hook for the shark and barracuda that has come at me than I'm still waiting for it after 12, 13 years of doing this. I still haven't caught a wahoo. I can't tell you why. I've been cut off more times than I can count in deeper water. But I'm looking for the bite first, okay? And being tied up with a shark, or particularly here with the shark situation that we have, and everybody I'm sure has been out there, and it's brutal. I don't want to be hooked into something that long and fight it for that long, or potentially damage tackle because I decided that I was going to go with wire for the 1 in 1,000 wahoo that I might get. You know, it's just kind of the cost of doing business when you're out there. Now, a longer shank hook is going to deliver more power to your hook set. So you are going to actually have to strike on that jig once you feel the bite. This brings up actually a different point, how the fish bite. Sometimes you feel a thud in that weight, you know, that thing came in hot and it quickly took the jig and kind of turned. Sometimes it's very subtle. You know, sometimes you have a situation where you just kind of, it's weightless for a second, right? Very important to first reel out the slack and then set your hook. You don't want to just aimlessly set because sometimes you're going to have a little bit belly in the line because that fish did come up, so there's a little bit of a belly. Also, if you have toothy fish that are out there. This is something that I've never really talked about, but if you're in an area where there's a lot of toothy stuff, a lot of kingfish, all right? Out here we have, you know, a good amount of kingfish, particularly if you go up north towards Stewart or any other kind of mackerels that have super toothy faces. You want to keep your actions much shorter, okay? Much, much shorter, very narrow, easy, quick pitches where you're kind of moving up and not letting that jig fall too far, Okay, if you let that jig fall too far, oftentimes you're going to have those cutoffs because the fish are going to cut off in the front. Or if you create a whole bunch of slack in your line because you're creating a big pitch, you're going to get a little bow in your line, you're going to have a much better chance to get cut off in those situations. I'm not telling you it's going to work every time, but it's going to better your odds in those particular situations while you're out there to have shorter movements when there's toothy stuff that is out there. That being said, in my opinion, if there's a whole bunch of toothy stuff out there, move your boat. Get away. It's just, I'd rather do that than lose, a bunch of jigs to barracudas and kingfish that are out there. The longer shank is going to hold a little bit better in the fish's mouth just because you got more real estate with that hook. And like I said, it's better for stuff that has teeth. All right. Now the bend of the hook, kind of the belly of the hook, and I'll use this larger example of a 620 hook so you guys can see it a little bit better. But you want to have that deep belly in the hook because this is where the weight of the hook, the fish is going to be once you get that penetration. Okay, so having a deeper belly in your hook here is going to give you a better hookup ratio, and more importantly, keep that fish on the hook as it comes up. Sometimes you'll see very shallow bends. Sometimes you'll see a very kind of a wide angle on the bottom there. That's going to do a couple of different things when we talk about points, but for the most part, that very circular bend that's in either of these two hooks tends to sit really well, particularly if you get good penetration and you have a bone that you're in this side, okay? Now, with respect to the point, okay, we have a couple of factors. So we have straight points, right? So this is kind of a wide gap where the point is facing more in this direction versus this narrower gap where the hook is facing like a tuna blade style back towards the eye a little bit. So what's the difference between the two? So a straight point is going to require a much active hook set. So if you have a short shank hook, you might mitigate you might lose a little bit of your penetration on it. So that's a problem. You want to make the penetration as easy as possible. But if you're more likely to snag. Okay, so if you have a wider gap on there, you're going to get hung up on the bottom more, and oftentimes you're going to snag other parts of the fish's face more rather than get into its mouth. All right. When you have a curved hook where you're pointing back in this direction towards the eye, that keeps the best possible effortless hook set especially with a narrow taper, a very slow taper of that point. Think, penetration with a hypodermic needle rather than a 2x4, right? It's going to go in there much easier. Less likely to snag just because there's less real estate to do so. So these are going to foul up on the bottom and not get snagged a lot less than a wider gap hook. And then lastly, this is kind of important, and unfortunately you can't really see it. What I said is the hook doesn't tilt, okay? It doesn't tilt when pressure hits it. It stays in the same position because you have the hook setting power of this. It keeps it much more in a straight line, and it's in the direction of the pull once you set the hook. So it's going to go back into the fish's face, or particularly you're going to get better hook sets, usually in bone when you use that tuna blade style hook. One of the things I was really excited that Gamakatsu did this year was it came out with individual unrigged 510 hooks. So these are 620 hooks, and it has that tuna blade style. I can rig them myself, goes back towards the eye, and this has been an absolutely awesome hook to use. So if you are looking for hooks or you're in the market for it, general things you're going to be looking for, in my opinion, and what I like and what I feel performs well, point going back towards the eye, good deep belly on there with a slightly thicker gauge, narrow taper, okay, and that longer shank on the hook. So those are all the things that I look for in a hook. Any questions on hooks before we go on, assist cord or anything else? No? What do you mean offset? Oh, like that kind of offset? Oh, I thought you were like staggering. I don't use offset, inline, 100% inline, yeah. You want these things to just be kind of facing each other, how these are. Acts as that snag, you're going to get that penetration, whether the jig is moving in this direction or this direction, you're going to get a bite that comes on very good penetration on these. If you ever look at hooks and you kind of drag them across your hand, a good indicator of a good hook is when it starts to catch your, like how this is catching my hand right now, just by rolling it over. That's going to show you kind of the penetration level of your hook. Oftentimes spade eye hooks, as opposed to an eyelet, will catch better because just of how the balance of the hook is. Once it comes off of the fish's face, and this is happening very, very quickly down there, it immediately goes into the fish's face. A lot of people are just scared to tie on spade eye hooks. Ultimately, I think there are better options. So ideally, longer shank, point back, spade eye, very narrow taper, good to go. All right. Anybody else? Yes.
How do you feel about feathers and fish skin on the hook compared to naked hook?
I hate when people put other crap on their hooks. I hate it with a passion. I don't think that having some tinsel or anything else is like the linchpin for catching, especially if you're in 500 feet of water. And ultimately, I think it harms you, and this is why. It's creating more drag, right? So if that jig is in the water and it's moving around and it's trying to swim, well, it's got more weight on it. The weight is minimal, but more importantly, the drag of those hooks are going to keep those hooks in different positions where you don't want them to be. Usually these jigs, because most of them are center weighted, this one's slightly front weighted, but mostly center weighted. What's going to happen is it's going to fall on the heavy side of the jig, and these are going to be falling in this position here. So as this jig goes down, these hooks are going to be kept a little bit higher. When you have that parachute that's on there, who knows what's happening with those hooks? They're going kind of all over the place. Do people catch fish on them? Obviously, all the time. I don't like them. I can say never use them or never have used them, but I haven't had any kind of extra stuff on my jigs in probably a decade. So I don't like it. Anybody else? All right.
You didn't say whether you like it in the front of the lure or the back or both ends.
So if there's two different types of jigging styles, right? There's speed jigging, right? Ripping it through the water column, about to have a stroke, that kind of jigging. And then there's slow jigging, right? When I'm speed jigging, I like to have a hook that is going to be single hook on top about this length, which is roughly a third of the jig's length. Okay, the reason why most fish are going to hit from the head first, and as the jig is ripping through the water column, they're going to hit from here. I just want that one hook on top. When you're jigging, slow jigging, this thing can go any direction. So if you pitch it up, right, and this is actually a good point to talk about different weightings of jigs, all right? So if I pitch this jig up and it starts to fall, and these hooks are kind of suspended as it's falling through the water, it's also going to start sliding in this fashion. But remember, fish are biting generally from the head first. If it's going in this direction, the fish doesn't know that this isn't a fish, so it's going to strike from here. Or if it's going in this direction, the fish is going to strike from here. All right, so that's why I'm always rigged when I slow jig with two hooks, top and bottom. That being said, if you notice that while you're out there, your tail hooks are fouling up on your line, because oftentimes that happens, and it's really bad when that happens in deep water, you're going too fast. What's happening is as you pitch the jig up, the jig is coming like this, and it's actually the tail is coming up and catching your line. So slow down. That's the fix for that. Once you slow down and get that good cadence that I was talking about before, that's going to perform a lot better in the water. Anybody else? Yes, sir. I'd say it's got to be 50-50. I mean, I don't think I could put a number on it. I can definitely put a number on retrieve bites versus fall bites, but I think, or what I focus on in terms of that, but in terms of where I get bites, it's about 50-50. It can be really anything. I haven't noticed any difference in terms of one or the other.
Years ago, the Orientals wanted you to put a solid ring on top of those for a nice split ring. Have they done away with that now?
No, it's actually the exact same. If you look at, for instance, I'll just kind of take. So my terminal connection here, I have an AG chain knot. Okay, so the AG chain knot is 100% connection. When we're done and we're doing kind of individual question and answer, I can show you how to tie it. I use this tool. It's called the quick chain tool because it has to be tied under tension. You can get these online at jigworks.com, works with an X. But this tool has been really invaluable to me using this AG chain knot. Okay, this is tied off to a swivel. Okay, so I have a ball bearing swivel. There's two ways you can do it. You can either tie to a ball bearing swivel like I have here, or you can tie to a solid ring. And that's personal preference. I tend to prefer a swivel because larger fish tend to spin on the way up. This allows them to spin independently and keep my line from twisting up at all. And then off of the bottom ring here is where my split ring is. Okay, and that is, if I have a jig, I'm going to tie my jig directly to that. Okay, so give me one sec. I'll show you why. So my hooks are completely independent of everything, but when I actually do hook into a fish, I have that straight line connection between everything. So the fish can't use that jig to rip or leverage that hook out of its face. It's a straight line connection no matter which way I go. Okay? So that's how I generally have them rigged. Anything else? Yes, sir.
So would you recommend soft wire?
No wire. Never use wire. No. 100% do not use wire. Ever. Yeah, I'm a no wire guy. Yeah, I rather lose the jig. Yeah, I mean, what would you rather do? Would you rather get cut off or fight a 150-pound bull shark for the next 40 minutes on under gear tackle? You know what I mean? It's just, yeah, no wire at all, for sure. Absolutely. It's the chances of you catching something that's worthwhile with teeth, it doesn't outweigh it for me. All right. So the last part of it, we've enticed the bite, right? We've talked about hooking the fish, and now we're going to talk about landing the fish. The first thing is proper drag settings, okay? So I'm going to pass this around. This is an OSHA Jigger LD. What I ask is that you don't touch the cam here. Don't twist this dial at all. It is set, kind of do this and get the line back to a reasonable spot for the next person. This is where my drag is set pretty much all the time, and oftentimes people, when they feel where my drag is set at, it's unexpected. So I'll give it to you, Lyle, and you can pass that around and see exactly where I have my drag settings. So my drag settings are generally between 12 and 15 pounds at strike, okay? That one in there is measured out at 13 pounds right now. That's what 13 pounds of drag feels like. A lot of people don't realize how much pressure 13 pounds of drag is. The super important part about it is it's much easier to back off your drag than it is to put more drag on your fish. Okay, so that's why I start with a pretty tight drag setting on there. Because if I have light line and I need to stop that fish, keep in mind my 20-pound Power Pro breaks usually between 38 and 41 pounds in a straight pull. Okay, so I have all the strength that I need in that line, but those drag settings are going to stop those bigger fish from getting me in the rocks. Also, I'm going to talk about lever versus star. Okay, if you watch people fish that are very experienced, oftentimes they're using a lever drag reel, and if you watch them on the lever, they're always on it, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. Okay, you're changing your drag based on what's going on in those moments. I realize that that's kind of an advanced maneuver. A lot of people are just worried about catching the fish, but you're going to land more fish if you can actually manipulate your drag effectively when that fish is coming up. So that's why I have my drag settings pretty tight to start. I can always back off of there, and on the OSHA LD, it is a tactile click as you back off on your drag, so you know you're not going too far. It is a full drag curve that is on there. So once you engage that drag, you're going up. That one puts out 44 pounds of drag. That's a ton of drag that it can handle. That just means that it's a lot more in the tank when you're out there. On a star drag reel, something like this is a 4,000, This is a 1500, but on the Star Drag, it's not quite as easy. I mean, yes, you have the tactile feel, but it's just not quite as precise as the lever when it's out there. But this does have auto engage. So that's kind of the trade-off. What is more important to you? Is it more important to have the auto engage feature on there, or is it more important to have the lever, which lets you do a little bit more precise drag? It's really a personal preference thing. I've landed tons of big fish on this OSHA 2000. I've landed a ton of big fish on the OSHA LD. The LD is an absolute beast, and I tend to go to that a lot more now that they have that, that available. Number 3, always be gaining. Always try to gain line no matter how small, okay? And I'm talking, if you can just get a quarter crank on that fish, you want to just try to gain line. It's a tug of war at that point, right? You have fish that are down there that are pulling really, really hard on you, and they stop for that second. Gain that line back as quickly as possible. Always focus on gaining line. Don't be afraid sometimes to even try to reel through the drag, okay? That way when the fish does stop, you are immediately turning and moving that fish. You want that fish's head turned. When I was in Panama last year, I landed a 100-pound class yellowfin tuna in 6 minutes and 38 seconds on 20-pound Power Pro and 50-pound leader with an OSHA, basically this exact setup, okay? Because I was always focused on gaining line. I let him do his thing when he was running. I was, trying to power through if I could, if he was taking drag, and the second that he stopped, I'm on it and I'm reeling, pointing and cranking on that fish. Super, super, super important. Don't take your time. Don't, this is a dogfight in the beginning, okay? You really need to be able to get your line. Luring them away is super important. That goes back to the cadence that I was saying. And then remember that original thing that I showed you with the bait ball and where the fish are going to go and the different patterns that they have in the water. You want to lure those fish away from the structure, right? One of the things you always hear, or I've heard a million times from a million different captains, is, what are you going to do with those little rods and that 20-pound line? We need to fish 80-pound here, minimum. No, you don't, because you're already up off the structure. You've got that space, and if you can lure those fish away, particularly, that's what I said about keeping, the first drop, faster cadence up, luring those fish away, getting that right action, luring those fish away. If you can do that, you're going to have a much better shot of getting those fish. The problem is the bigger ones tend to be on the bottom, pinned to the bottom. So how do you stop them? Use your body, not the rod, okay? Use your body, not the rod. What do I mean by that? When I set a hook on a fish, I'm pitching the jig, everything is going hunky-dory, I'm hooking, got a bite, reel, 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 set the hook, right? That line is even with the horizon, parallel to the horizon. I'm not coming up too far. They're certainly not going to come up this high, but I'm going to set that hook right about this position here, and I have that kind of that standoff, and I know I can't really gain line, so what do? Drop. I drop into it. If you drop into it, you're creating your own space. If you drop into it, your legs are pushing back up against the boat on a very solid platform, and I guarantee you that your legs are stronger than your arms, okay? That is going to give you the best possible chance to get those first quick cranks on that fish to get him up, 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 away from where he's trying to go. Once he gets away from that structure, then you can start playing with your drag. Then you can back off your drag, just like any other kind of fishing. You get a big black grouper on there. As he comes up, he's not going to be fighting quite as much. You know you're out of the danger zone. You've already counted your handle turns as you're coming up. You know you have that fish 20 feet off the bottom. All right, I can back off my drag a little bit. I'm out of danger. And now I'm worried about making sure that that hook doesn't pull. I'm pointing at the fish. I'm kind of letting that rod absorb any kind of head shakes and thumps that it does. But I'm just letting that fish do his thing and always be gaining. The second that he stops, I'm on it again, okay? The last part is direct control versus bent control. Okay, so I'm going to need a volunteer for this one. Who wants to volunteer? Lyle, thank you. All right, so I'm going to take this hook off because it's kind of dangerous. So the first thing I'm going to show you, and you might want to, oops. So if you could grab that line there and kind of stand over here a little bit, kind of out of the camera. All right, so I'm gonna let it out. If I'm in this position here, kind of start jerking that thing down. I can't really control the fish in this position here, right? But if I'm in a direct connection, I can pull a grown man across the room. Okay? Direct control. Straight line control. That's why you want to be straight in line with that fish, because I can put way more heat in a straight pull this way than I can ever do by trying to fight the fish on a bend. All right? So keep that in mind. Sometimes you'll get into those situations where a really big fish will hit on the bottom or close to the bottom, and you'll see me with my rod in the water, straight in the water. And I'm using up and down vertical, and I'm pulling back on the fish in that straightaway. I'm pulling his head in the other direction. All right, so super important, direct control, not bent control on the fish. And if that example doesn't kind of teach that to you, I don't know what else I can do, guys. So it's super, super, super important, and it will ultimately wind up landing you more fish, okay?
Question.
Yes.
Fish rocks you off. Do you, in your opinion, everyone has a different school of thought. Free spool, give them 5 minutes. Do you flick the line for?
I'll free spool. I don't do the guitar thing because I don't want tension on the line. If you're bait fishing, it's a little bit different. Sometimes people play the old banjo and have a chance of with the vibrations they think gets the fish to come out. Maybe it does, sometimes it does. Most of the time that I've seen, it really doesn't. But I will take the pressure off of that fish, because once it feels like it's not in danger anymore, it tends to come out easier. And then the other option is hitting spool lock on there and just breaking off because it's game over. But those are kind of, I definitely reduce the pressure on the fish for sure. Anybody else? Yes, sir. I only use single speed reels. So I don't particularly find the need for me to use a 2-speed reel. What I would say is, if you're in a situation where you are using a 2-speed reel and you do have a very big fish on that requires it on the bottom, drop it into your low gear and try to get those cranks on the fish, still pointing at the fish, mind you, but try to drop it into low gear at that time. Once you get the fish coming off the bottom, keeping in mind that your gear ratio has changed substantially from your high gear ratio, usually at least by half, that means you're going to need to have double the cranks to get that fish the equivalent distance off the bottom before you start going back into your high gear settings. And once that fish is up, then you can put it back into high gear. If the fish happens to be a massive fish that is just not cooperating, then you're in it in low gear, right? And that's just going to be pain. But it's going to be easier than single speed. For me, with these particular reels, in particular that OSHA Jigger lever drag, it has so much torque that I haven't had to, any situation anywhere that I've fished, whether it's New England, California, Charleston, down here, the Gulf, Panama, wherever, I haven't had a situation where I couldn't make cranks on it. So, but if you are using a 2-speed, I would use it at the bottom during the initial part of the fight. Once you realize that you're in that standoff where you're not gaining and he's not pulling, right? Anybody else?
Question about drag.
Yes, sir.
So you set your drag to like 13 pounds, say in the beginning. Maybe I'm not wording this right, but I think every 100 foot it increases by like 2 pounds. I feel like, how do you measure?
So good point. So I don't know what the exact formula is in terms of how that drag pressure increases as you go deeper. And what Adrian's getting to is, as you go further down the spool, your effective drag increases. Okay, so if you're fishing in deep water, that is another reason why, even though I can use this OSHA 2000 and get down in very deep water, I'm very far down in the spool. So my drag at the surface, whatever I set it at, could be as high as twice as high as what I had it at the surface at the bottom, just because I'm so far down the spool. That's why I like using something like this when I go to deeper water, because I'm going to be much less down the spool at depth, so I have much more consistent drag to what I set it at the top. That being said, I do reduce my drag. I don't usually have it set at 13 pounds when I'm fishing in, north of 500 feet. I will bump that drag down a little bit, particularly if I know that that reel is going to be more than a third down the spool. Okay, that makes sense to answer the question? Yeah, sir.
Stupid question. When you go to re-spool your line, why not when you get a third of the way down, test it?
Could, yeah. I just haven't. That's not really a stupid question. That's a great suggestion, actually. Actually.
Re-spool our line for real so much.
Yeah.
Next time we get down to that far.
Yeah, usually I'm just standing there with a power drill, just buzzing the thing off, But no, that's a great point. Yeah, I could do that next time and see exactly what it turns into and have a better idea. I mean, that's one of the, this shop, Custom Rod and Reel, that machine, it's probably out of the camera right now, but there's a line testing machine. And Jordan knows when I first started this, and Jim knows too, because he was there at the beginnings. I can't tell you how many times I used that thing to test the braking strength of all of our stuff, whether it was Power Pro, Suffix 832, Fireline Crystal, crazy Japanese stuff that nobody's heard about, whatever it is. We've had it on that machine and tested it, and that's why we know a lot of what we know is because of that. So, but that's a good suggestion. I'll probably try it next time. So, anybody else? No? All right. Whoa. Ruh-roh. Sorry, guys. All right. So, this is your exit through the gift shop section. And I'm going to talk to you about Shimano's technology. All right? Because I think it's important to me, and I think one of the reasons why I've been successful in this in terms of seminars and getting information to people is that people realize that I don't use stuff that I don't believe in, okay? So a lot of times you'll hear me talk about this stuff, and oh, he's sponsored by Shimano, so he must have a reason why he's doing it, or he's just using marketing speak for stuff. But really, this is the stuff that makes you land fish better. So in these rods, let's first talk about the Ocean Infinity Motive. Okay, so this rod is a 6'10" rod, so it's longer than most traditional slow pitch rods. The reason why is because they specifically wanted to have a longer rod to perform better in deeper water. Okay, this thing was originally released in 2019, and last year in 2024 it was re-released after going through a bunch of different prototypes. When they did the release, Shimano, as part of incorporating their first JDM rod into the United States, sent over Hiroto Yamamoto from Japan, who is me times 10 over there, to fish with me in Charleston. So it was really cool to get to fish with him, and shows that Shimano's commitment to the United States jigging market, which they realize is growing quite popular, especially in recent years. So what he did in the development and testing of this rod was to make a rod that is going to perform very well in deep water, irrespective of the jig weight that you're using. So if you're in 600 feet of water and you can use a 200-gram jig, this rod is rated to 280 grams, I believe. So 280 grams on this rod will perform perfectly in 800 feet of water, okay? And it has a couple of features in it in the Shimano technology that allows you to do that. So the first thing is what this rod is made of at its core. So when you roll a blank, you have to impregnate that blank with resin, and that keeps the shape of it on the mandrel. So in this, what we have is called Spiralex core. What that does is it's several layers of carbon. So you have a layer that runs vertically, then you have layers that wrap on top of that. Those layers are then impregnated with a Toray nano alloy, and that makes it extremely compressionally rigid, meaning that rod won't ovalize under load. Rods that are hollow and ovalize is when the rods break. So it's extremely tough in terms of the power that it has, but it's also very twist resistant. It's much more torsionally resistant. So any high-end Japanese rod all has conventional guides on top. Generally speaking, if you have, you see guides that are spiral, usually that's masking inferior blank that's twisting to kind of cover up that twist that's on there. These do not have that issue. I have tried my hardest to get these rods to twist. If you stand here and you try to twist the rod, it doesn't move the rod actually, it's so rigid. So you're gonna keep completely on spine, which creates better actions, and it makes making those actions easier for you. High Power X. You've probably seen on Shimano rods, they have that kind of cross weave, that X pattern that goes all the way down. That's a wrap that goes on top of the core. What that does is it allows this rod to be completely fine-tuned to create very precise actions. And that goes across the lineup for Shimano. So this particular rod is tuned to have action, and this section of the rod here has a very lively tip and shuts off right about here, okay? Every rod is tuned specifically to the weight of jigs that they're using, and all of them are color-coded, which is cool because they all basically look the same. And how many times have you been on the boat with 4 of the same rods and you're like, what is this? I don't know about you guys, but in low light situations, I can't see at all anymore. So trying to look and see what model it is, it doesn't work. You know what your colors are. So you've got this tan color, that's your medium light. You've got your blue, which is your medium. You've got your kind of orange color here, and you can see that this rod does break down into its 2 pieces. So travels really well. It's about 5.5 feet. It does come with this really cool rod sock for protection when it travels, and these bands that'll keep everything together. And then once you get to the heavy, you've got green. So you can quickly look at your identical setups and be able to you pick the rod that you need for that particular day. Also has X guides. So conventional guides, one of the issues that people have are tip wraps. You notice that these guides at the end start laying down in this direction. The line slides off. So you don't get tip wrapped hardly at all with these. And as I was told by a very prominent jig fisherman from Japan, if you have a problem with tip wraps, just pay attention. And that was, I was like, fair enough. Exactly as I expected. So. There is a warranty on the rods, yes, but it winds up being not a full replacement. There's a discounted replacement value, and you would send that rod back to Shimano. They have 2 locations to do that, either in Ladson, South Carolina, which is near Charleston, or in Irvine, California, which are the two hubs for it. Same thing with your reels. If you're sending your reels in for maintenance, depending on where you live, obviously we're here in Florida right now, East Coast, we would send them to a Charleston location, or if you're in the West Coast, you can send them out to Irvine. On Shimano's website, fish.shimano.com, there is a section where you can click on the form. Basically, you fill out your form, send it back, they fix it up, charge you whatever they're going to charge you. Usually it's nominal unless you've done some serious damage to the thing, but whether everything is warranted and everything is serviceable, okay? The last thing that it has on these rods is called the CI4 Plus Reel Seat. Okay, so the CI4 Plus reel seat is a proprietary thing to Shimano. A lot of people are very familiar with Fuji reel seats. This is actually impregnated with carbon, so it's very light, very rigid, but also very ergonomic. So this thing holds your hand very well. It also transmits vibration very well, so it's very sensitive. Okay, so those 4 features of these rods really, I think, are key in terms of allowing you to land bigger fish and do it more consistently. Moving over to your reels, that lever drag, where did that thing end up? Oh, there it is. Thank you, Jordan. All right, so let's talk about this thing. So 5 years ago when I started with Shimano, I said, guys, there's no lever drag that you have out there. You know what you need to do? You need to make a Talica 12. You need to put an overhang on it. You need to have a longer handle with a T-arm. And that's what they did. So in this reel in particular, it does a couple of things. So the first one is infinity drive. So infinity drive is the internal portion of this reel. So on the A side of the reel, the handle side of the reel, there is your drag plate in the middle, and we have 2 drag washers that compress that drag plate over here. That does a couple of things. Number 1, it doubles your output of your drag. That's why this thing can put out 44 pounds of drag, legit 44 pounds of drag at a full spool. Okay. The other thing that it does is under load, the gearing in this is such that it's about 30% less to rotate the handle under load, which goes back to your question, which is why I don't need a 2-speed reel. This thing is so easy to turn the handle when you actually are on a fish that at first it feels weird. It feels like you're not gaining line until you fish it for about a month and you go, oh wait, what they were telling me actually is true. And you can gain a lot of line, a lot easier with this reel. And then there's the handle, okay? This seems like something that's very silly. Why is that handle so important? This goes to ergonomics. Now, I've got your OSHA 4000 and an OSHA 2500 LD, and you can notice the differences in the handle. On the OSHA 4000, it's a T handle, but it's very vertical, okay? So when you're cranking on fish, you're stuck in this position here. What that does is it puts a bit more pressure on your forearm, and if you're out there in the July sun, you probably notice that you've had cramps in your forearms. I know I've had times where like I've jigged for days straight and I'm like getting cramps and my fingers are going doing this. It keeps you in a tight position. It's a very ergonomic handle, but they fixed it. They fixed the issue. Offsetting it just slightly, okay? So this handle is hollow, so even though it's large, it doesn't add any extra weight to your reel, but having it in this position over here, now I'm using the bigger muscles of my shoulder and my chest to push through. So between the 30% less to turn the handle and that positioning of your hand, super good for what we're looking to do. The other part is capacity. This is gonna hold 900 yards of 20-pound Power Pro. So you can fish from very shallow to very deep. Additionally, on the side, ergonomic-wise, it's about the same spool height as the OSHA 2000, okay? The same spool width as a 4000. All right, so a little bit wider, but still very ergonomic. You can still use one hand to operate that, or as I like to fish it on the drop, I can create my own auto engage by fishing in that position there. So super ergonomic. Also has cutouts here for your index finger to put a little pressure on the spool on that initial drop. Just a bunch of really great stuff that makes this thing very, very good. It comes in 2 models. It comes in a mid-gear, which is a 5.7-to-1, picks up 42 inches per crank, or a 6.2-to-1, which picks up 42 inches crank or 46 inches per crank in the high gear. My kind of dividing line is I use the mid-gear from about 400 under, 400 deeper. I use the high gear just to keep my cranks consistent as I'm going down there. Line Power Pro, I talked a beginning kind of out of turn for why I use the 4-strand as opposed to 8-strand line. I like a standard white Power Pro. The reason why I like white line is because it's just easy to see. It doesn't bleed because there's no colors that are on it. I particularly like that. I've been using the Depth Hunter though a bit more recently, and that's this line here. So same 4-strand line, but it is metered, so if you have suspended fish, you can count the lines as they go out. But I'm gonna be completely honest with you guys, I'm bad at that. I'm really bad at counting those lines as they go out, and I feel like a lot of people have issues with that. Where it does come into play though, is when you're actually hooked up at the bottom, okay? At that point, you can see what color you're at. And if that fish starts pulling drag, and you know I'm 6 cranks off the bottom, I'm 18 feet off the bottom, and I see those colors going out, I know when I have to actually make the decision, it's either the fish or something's breaking, right? And that's where that comes really into play for me, is fishing on the bottom and watching that line come out. So that's it's very useful when you're fishing and you are fishing for bigger stuff where drag is being pulled. The other option is the Max Quattro, which is a 4-carrier line. As I mentioned before, it's 25% thinner, so same breaking strength, more capacity. If I put Max Quattro 20-pound on this, I get 1150 on there. So that is an absolute ton of line that you can get on your reels. And that concludes the presentation. So, if there are any other questions? Yes, sir. There you.
So you mentioned how when you go deep, you like to maintain your IPT, your inches per turn, right? So Shimano has an OSHA jigger that is an XG. I don't know if Brandon know about it, and I think it gets
Yep.
over 46.
Mhm.
What is the place of that really slopeless jigging with one, and when would you use it?
Yeah, personally, I think the XG is a bit too much. Let's back up one step though. In Japan, they're fishing on usually spankered boats with bow thrusters. Okay, so it's a different boat profile that they're doing. So the current and wind influence is almost completely negated, and they can fish vertically on both sides of the boat. What that means is that they can use smaller reels to get down faster and deeper, or to get down to deeper water using like a 2000 size reel. When you have the XG and you are going to those deeper waters and you're down to a PE like 1 or PE 1.3, so you're getting probably 700, 800 yards on something like the 2000 size, that XG is going to compensate in those situations where you're very deep and you're very far down the spool, okay? Oftentimes I think that the super high gear is just a little bit too much, including like, for instance, when I fished in California, notice that the fish that using a high gear reel the fish weren't actually active in attacking those, but when you switch to a power gear reel, it's just because they didn't move that much. So the slower retrieve actually benefited you in that situation. So it's kind of two things. The other thing that those reels have, particularly like the F Custom, which is available in Japan, is the fall lever. Okay, and that gets into a different, even more advanced technique. Okay, so the fall lever essentially is a lever that goes onto the brake on this side, and what it does is by engaging that lever, it allows you to change the fall speed of the jig. Where that really comes into play, because think of it this way: if you're jigging and you're completely locked up, your bail is engaged, right? There's no free spool that's happening. But what's on the 2000, because it has auto engage on it, you can actually, once you pitch, put the reel into free spool, and that's where that fall lever comes into play. Because now you're falling in free spool, but you're only using the tension that's put by that fall lever on your line as it's going down. So by changing the tension, you can change the fall to more of a spiral or a wider fall, and then once a fish does bite and you hit that, you're in on it. So that's why you're not going to see a fall lever on something like a lever drag. It doesn't necessarily make sense because you don't have that quick engage on it, but that's just a little extra tidbit. Anybody else? Yes, sir.
Do you think the XG platform would be better, heavier current situations, or the multi?
I think it's more of a depth thing. I think it's much more of a depth thing. And one of my concerns isn't necessarily the inches per crank per se. It's that once you go to the higher gears, you're starting to lose torque at that point, right? So just like when you're riding a bicycle, once you have that higher gear setting, it's a whole lot easier to pedal that bike, but you're not gaining ground. Like you ever see someone with the wrong gear riding down the street and their feet are going like this, but they're going, that slow? Kind of that concept. You're not going to be able to gain line on bigger stuff with that higher gear, I think, as easily. I think you actually benefit from a lower gear ratio. So I don't think necessarily the current is the influence. I think it's really what you want. The depth is the biggest choice for your gear ratios. Anybody else? Yes, sir.
On our side, when you're running bigger jigs with this right current,
Mm-hmm.
do you ever switch over to bigger single hooks? Are you always?
Yes, sir. Yes. When I run into deeper water, oftentimes, and this is a little bit big, I'll use kind of a 6, this one here. Yeah, 6.0 Gamakatsu singles, same profile. And I've actually weighed these out. So this one weighs only 1 gram more than a light 2-hook rig like this. So it doesn't really add that much influence, particularly on the larger jigs. Yeah, if you're going deeper, larger singles, what I found with the larger singles, usually, usually you get a better hook set in the mouth on those larger singles, and you want that in the deeper water as opposed to something in the face which could maybe pull through the skin easier. Anybody else? Adrian.
I just want to clarify that. So your reasoning for choosing between doubles and singles is mainly for the size of the mouth?
No, my choice between singles and doubles is that in singles you tend to get a better hook set in the mouth of the fish, whereas doubles you tend to get a hook set in and around the mouth. And the last thing you want to have is a snowy with a hook in its cheek, and then you get it halfway up and it pulls out, right? Almost every single time when I have a fish on a single hook, it's in the mouth, past the jaw, and it's buried. It's absolutely buried in there. Anybody else? All right. Well, thank you so much for coming out. Thank you to Custom Rod and Reel for having us, and hope you appreciate it. Thank you.
It's like it's braided.
So it's alternating half hitches, and it does a couple of things. The first thing that's important, under load, it'll kind of stretch a little bit and act as a spring. Also, these half hitches that go up here will kind of provide an additional abrasion resistance, which allows you to drop down to that 30 and 40 pound leader as opposed to 50, because you're not worried so much about the abrasion on that area. This is a 100% knot, so. And it's pretty simple to tie once you do it a few times. I'll show you guys. I'll show you how to tie it. All right. So first thing that you're going to do, whether you have a solid ring or a swivel, is you're going to make a cow hitch. All right. So you're just going to kind of how you start a Palomar. Oops. You're going to pass through here. and then pass right back there. Okay, so you're on. You want to leave a good tag in because you're going to have to tie those half hitches over and over again. So I leave a good amount of tag, which is one of the reasons why I start with like a 15-foot leader. Okay, so you just pass through, create that cow hitch here. Biggest thing at this point is you want to make sure that your lines are parallel, that they're not overlapping, right? Just like a Palomar, right?
Or like the cat's paw.
Exactly. So I have my line together, it's parallel, like that. Simple cow hitch. Now is where the tool comes into play. So you tie off on your terminal. I want to get a good amount of tension on that line, in particular on this right here. So I want to dig into this grommet here. Pass through a few more times just to get that tension, because I don't want this line to slide. All right. Now, you notice that the way that I have this here, the tag is on the right side. Okay. So that means, and the cow hitch is in front. All right. If people mess up this knot, usually it's the first one that they're going to mess up. If you mess up the first one, then you're not going to have a 100% knot. It's still going to be strong, it's still going to hold, but you may have a weird break off. We're going to alternate half hitches. The first one is always over, okay? So, over, 1, under, 2, okay? And I'm going to do that to be about like an inch and a quarter long, okay? Usually it works out to be about 12 over under. So I did under, so I'll go over, under, under.
And say you break off, fish are biting. Are you really taking the time to go and tie this knot because of how much better it is, or are you gonna just freaking tie you and you don't have to go back to?
I'm going to grab one of the other 6 rods that I have rigged up.
I guess that's very true. Just like pipefish.
All right, so see how everything lines up, and the reason why they call it a chain is you can see that chain forming down the side of it. When you finish this knot, I just tied the last half hitch. All I do is just cut there. There's nothing further to do. You don't have to finish this any special way. I've never had one unravel in that particular location. But you can see on the back end, that cat's paw, I'll zoom in here. See that cat's paw is a little bit wide here. Mm-hmm. So when you're using 50 pound and under, you do the cat's paw. There's a separate way to do it for the heavier diameter lines because you can actually keep that a little bit more parallel in there. But at this length, you're good. Once it goes under load, it'll stretch and it'll actually cinch down, and it is a 100% connection when you do it that way.
Half hitches all the way up?
Yeah, alternating half hitches. So you start with an over, under, and you do it, about that length or so.
No glue?
Not on this, no. On my PR, I do. A PR, I put a little drop of super glue on there. So, this is kind of what my PR looks like ultimately. So you can see that the line has changed color to be a translucent at this particular length. So this is, you can see the difference in the color of the line. That translucent lets you know that you have the proper amount of tension on that bobbin. I like to have it at least this long, at least that long. Sometimes they'll go as long as about that. This is going to be another 100% connection. Where I do put my glue is going to be at the very, very end here, where I do a rizzuto to finish that knot. That stops any kind of tag from unraveling there. Cut tight, good to go. Passes through any guide seamlessly.
You don't use the FG knot at all?
No. The reason why I don't use an FG knot is because back in the day, I had this fishing mentor, and he gave me the best fishing advice I ever had, and it was never lose a fish from preventable error. And I consider your knots a preventable error. So if I have the option to tie an FG knot, which on its best day is 80-85%, or I can tie a 100% knot, I'm tying the 100% knot every single time.
So the P knot's stronger than the other?
This is by Jigworks. My buddy Chad Bougier designed it. After a trip to Japan, he realized that we needed a tool like this, and ever since he designed this, I've been using this exclusively on everything. And then one of the other things that we designed was this here. This is the plug. So if you have the butt end of your rod here, you want to protect that at all times. So what you do is you just clip this guy on like this, and it fits any gunnel. It keeps your rod completely secure from bouncing around in there. So these are also available on JigWorks, and they fit any standard slow pitch blank, and they slide very easily, but they, more importantly, will keep your rod secure from bouncing around when you're out in the water.